Oh, good evening, and welcome back to the Poe Museum. I'd like to introduce you to this woman. It's Sarah Helen Whitman. And in this picture, she's actually doctored the photo to make herself look like the pallid bust of Pallas from Poe's poem The Raven. And that's not the strangest thing she's done. You'll find out more about her in tonight's installment of the Curator's Crypt. Well, tonight's video came at the suggestion of one of our Patreon patrons who wanted to know more about Sarah Helen Whitman. I've spoken about her in a lot of the previous videos as being Poe's next to last fiancée. They were engaged for about a month before she broke it off. She said that she could do nothing to help Poe, that he wouldn't give up drinking for her, and it didn't happen. But who is this woman? And why did she think she was Poe's soulmate? And why did he seem to think he was for a while too? Well, Sarah Helen Whitman happened to be born on January 19th. If you're doing the math, that's Poe's birthday, but she's older than he was. So she'd gotten a start as a poet a little bit earlier. And she's born in Providence, Rhode Island. And while she was there, she was abandoned by her father at an early age, and that left her with her mother and two sisters, one of whom died early too. And then she started writing poetry and sending up to Boston, one of the big literary centers in the United States, and was getting published. And she caught the attention of Sarah Josepha Hale. You probably haven't heard of her. She's the one that wrote Mary Had a Little Lamb. But in her time, she was the first woman in America to edit a major magazine, and eventually she became editor of the most popular magazine in the United States, Godey's Ladies' Book. But that's a little bit later. We're getting ahead of ourselves. Right now, we're talking about how she sort of discovered Sarah Helen Whitman, invited her up to Boston. And Boston was a place where Unitarianism, Transcendentalism, Abolitionism, everything was going on there. That's the place to be in intellectual circles. This is where Emerson was. And she met Emerson up there and got really interested in Transcendentalism. And through the Transcendentalist circles, she met Margaret Fuller, who was editor of The Dial, a Transcendentalist publication, and a big women's rights advocate. So Sarah Helen Whitman got involved in that too. And while she was there, she became Sarah Helen Whitman. Before, she'd just been Sarah Helen Power, but she met John Whitman, married him. He was editor of the Boston Spectator, and she started helping edit the magazine. She helped write articles, and that's really how she got her connections inside the Boston literary world. And things were going great, but 5 years later, her husband died. And she was obliged to go back to Providence, live with her ailing mother, her mentally ill sister, and take care of them. But that didn't stop her from writing. She's continued to send her works to publications. And then Sarah Josepha Hale moved down to Philadelphia, worked at Godey's Ladies' Book, and invited Whitman to submit to her. So Whitman's poems were being published all over the country. People knew who she was. This is long before Walt Whitman, where Walt Whitman is 10 years younger than Edgar Allan Poe, so that sort of puts in the time frame. And since she wasn't in one of the major literary centers like Boston or New York, she developed this reputation as kind of an outsider, sort of an eccentric. And that got more and more people interested in her and her writing. And she did get to know the New York literary circles. And people who saw her said she dressed all in white, that she wore a little pendant shaped like a coffin, that she preferred to have her rooms drenched in red lights, blocking out the sunlight. And in her mother's house, which is still standing up in Providence, she kept a big rose garden out back, and she used to tend to the roses. And one of the people who heard about Sarah Helen Whitman was Edgar Allan Poe. By this time, he's living in New York. He's carrying on with one of Sarah Helen Whitman's friends, Frances Sargent Osgood. And Poe and Frances went to Providence, and while they were there, it was a hot summer night. Edgar said, "I couldn't sleep," and he just wandered around the streets of the city at night. And in the moonlight, he came upon Sarah Helen Whitman, all dressed in white, sitting in her rose garden. And he spied on her. He didn't say anything to her, didn't introduce himself or anything. And then he went back to New York to his wife and family. And it was a few more years, another 3 years before Poe's wife had died and Poe's single again. And back in New York, the literary hostess Anne Charlotte Lynch was throwing a literary soiree, her annual Valentine's Day party, and she invited all of her poet friends to contribute Valentine's poems to be read on the occasion. And since they're all kind of famous poets afterwards, they would have their works published together. So what does Whitman do? She sends in a Valentine called To Edgar A. Poe. It's all about how she wants to fly away with the raven to his lofty eyrie in the sky. And Anne Lynch was horrified. She said that, some of her friends wouldn't be her friends anymore if she even invited Poe to her parties. He had a bad reputation. He used to go, but he got kicked out. So she agreed to read the poem, but when it came time to publish it with everybody else's, she sort of gave the poem to Frances Osgood and said, hey, can you sort of pass this on to Edgar? And in the meantime, Sarah Helen Whitman was asking, well, is my poem going to be published? And Anne had to ask her, can you send me another one? Because I kind of gave that one away. But it did get published. And somehow Edgar Poe saw the poem. And what do you do when you see some woman you've never met, but you've heard of her? You've seen her. And now she's written a poem about you. Well, he ripped one of his old poems, a 17-year-old poem called To Helen, out of a book, put an envelope and mailed it to her, anonymously. That was his first move. I don't know if he expected her to know that was his poem or to recognize his handwriting. She recognized his handwriting anyway because she'd seen it somewhere else before. And why did he pick out a 17-year-old poem called To Helen? It's because he'd written that poem for his first great love, the woman he called the first purely ideal love of my soul. Her name was Jane Stannard. When he was 14 years old, he fell madly in love with her. And she gave him encouragement, nurtured his poetry. But shortly after they met, she ended up going insane and dying. So one of his great compliments he would give women, he would give it to Marie Louise Schuh, later Sarah Helen Whitman, is you are the embodiment of my first love. Yeah, so he'd compare women to his first crush. That was his big compliment for them. So he sent her the poem. She didn't write back. So then Poe turned around and wrote another poem, this time an original poem. He sent it to her, and it's all about how I was watching you that night in your garden, and the moonlight fell upon the upturned faces which grew in an enchanted garden. That's where we get the term enchanted garden, which is the name of our garden here at the Poe Museum. And I think she was impressed by this one. But then what Poe did was he wanted to meet her. So how he's going to meet her? He sent a letter. He used a fake name on the letter to ask for her autograph. And that was going to see if she was home or not. If she was home, he was going to go up to Providence and visit her. So he went there and they met. And they took a long romantic walk through the most beautiful cemetery in all Providence. And she said, this is the grave of one of my lost loves. I'd like to visit it sometime. And Poe told her, let me tell you about graveyards. I used to visit my first love's grave in Shockoe Hill Cemetery back in Richmond. In fact, after I got married, I used to take my wife up to see it and say, hey, that's my first love's grave there. So they bonded over that. But also they bonded over the fact that they were both born on January 19th. And Poe even worked out that if you used her maiden name Power and took the W out, it says something like, Sarah Lenore, like she was the angel Lenore. So they found all sorts of reasons why they were soulmates. And Sarah Helen Whitman by this time had adopted spiritualism. She's getting very interested in the spiritualist movement, the idea of being able to speak with the dead. She was interested in the teachings of Andrew Jackson Davis, who was a trance medium. He'd go into a trance on stage and communicate with the dead. And he said that while he was in a trance state, he saw another world called Summerland, and it was a perfect world beyond our own. So these are the kind of ideas that were of interest to Sarah Helen Whitman. So when she read Poe's stories about mesmerism, about speaking with the dead, things like the facts in the case of M. Valdemar, about a man who's mesmerized at the moment of death to keep his mind alive after his body was dead so they could communicate with him after his death. He was in a trance for something like 7 months. When they finally woke him up from his trance, he'd been dead so long, the guy just dissolved into a pool of goo. And people thought that was a true story at the time. They actually wrote to him and said, you're just pretending that's fiction, right? That really is true. And Sarah Helen Whitman even either believed the story or wanted it to be true, so she had to meet this guy. Before she wrote him the Valentine's poem, she started asking her friends, what do you know about this guy? Is he single? What can you tell me about him? Have you ever met him? And they would have inform on Poe and say, this is what I know about him. Anne Lynch, for her part, said he's done a great many abominable things and he has no moral character. Watch out for this guy. And that probably made Sarah Helen Whitman even more interested in him. But anyway, they met, and the rest is kind of like I told you before. Poe was insistent we have to get married right away. We got to do this. Whitman's mother said, there's no way, you can't trust this guy. He's after you for your money. You have to make him sign a document that says that he doesn't have any access to any of your money. And apparently Poe made a promise, I'm never going to drink alcohol again. If you just stay with me, I'm not going to drink again. And their engagement lasted 1 month. And Whitman, she had a heart condition and she was always worried about getting worked up. She carried on ether with her. If she ever felt she was getting nervous or worked up, she just would inhale a little bit of ether and knock herself out. Well, Poe went to her house. He pleaded with her, give me one last chance. Don't give up on your dearest, dearest Eddie. Don't leave me now, my beloved Helen. And she apparently just knocked herself out on some of her ether, and her mother kicked him out of the house, and that's the last she ever saw of him. But it might not be the last she ever heard of him. The following year, shortly after he died, she said that she was sitting in her room thinking through the things she would have said to him, the questions she would have asked him if he hadn't died. And as she's asking one of these mental, internal questions, she heard a knock coming from behind her. Nobody else was there. So then she asked another mental question, heard another knock coming from front of her. Tried it again, and there's another knock coming from the hallway. And if you're an 1840s spiritualist, you've probably heard of the Fox sisters. And their whole deal was people would ask them questions and they'd ask the spirits to make knocking noises. So knocking was really big. It didn't mean that you had rats in your house. It meant there was a spirit trying to communicate with you. So she hired a professional medium to move into her house with her and help her communicate with Poe's spirit. And after a while, she became a professional medium. And before you know it, people started writing her and say, hey, can you pass this message on to Poe for me? Can you ask him this question for me? And she was considered the spiritual telegraph, the medium of communication between this world and Poe. And it said she would have regular Sunday seances, and that's when she'd keep her house all swathed in red inside, and red light, red curtains to keep even the light from outside from getting too bright. And she was still writing poetry. So 1853, that's about 4 years after Poe's death, she published a book of her poetry. But she's also submitting poetry to anthologies and to magazines. And this is Sarah Helen Whitman's best-known work. It's Edgar Poe and His Critics from 1860. This is sort of her mini biography of Poe from her perspective. And as you can tell from the title, it's also about his critics, in particular Rufus Griswold, the guy who just tried to smear Poe's reputation after he died. And she writes in here, Dr. Griswold's memoir of Edgar Poe has been extensively read and circulated. Its perverted facts and baseless assumptions have been adopted into every subsequent memoir and notice of the poet and have been translated to many languages. For 10 years, this great wrong to the dead has passed unchallenged and unrebuked. So she's going to challenge that with this book. Now, why did she wait till 1860 if Poe died back in 1849? I think she wanted to wait till Griswold was also dead. He was a very powerful figure in the United States literary scene. He was an important editor and anthologist. He's the kind of guy who would make or break a career. So she waited till he was good and dead before she wrote this book, really trashing him too, and trying to show the Poe that she knew. and saying he wasn't quite the person, the myth that we've been force-fed through all these biographies. So that's one of her great contributions, and that one went through a couple different editions. So she continued to work to try to rehabilitate Poe's character. And after this, by the 1870s, John Henry Ingram and William Gill and other people were writing biographies of Poe. And they wanted to go back to the sources, to speak with the people who'd known him best. So Whitman provided interviews, provided information for these different biographers. And that'll be her great contribution to Poe's studies. When she died in 1878, she let posterity know what was really important to her. In her will, she set aside money to publish this: one last collection of her poetry. For this person who devoted herself to exploring mysticism, the occult, spiritualism, transcendentalism, she really put it all into this book of poetry. And of course, there's some poems in here about Poe, like this one, The Phantom Voice, which is dated right down there, November 1849, so just 1 month after Poe's death. And in addition to this, she also left money for the Providence Association for the benefit of colored children, and also the Rhode Island Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. So she was an animal lover on top of all that. But was she Poe's soulmate? Would it have ever worked out with Poe and her? Or was Virginia Poe his soulmate? Or maybe Elmira Shelton or Annie Richmond? Let us know down in the comments what you think. And thanks to David for suggesting this topic for a video. And if you'd like to help us preserve precious Poe pieces, like these rare early books by Sarah Helen Whitman, why not make a donation, contribute to the Poe Museum, or become a member at poemuseum.org. And until next time, thanks for joining us, and I leave you with more gratuitous footage of the Poe Museum cats doing Poe Museum cat stuff.